That 10-pound bag landed on the kitchen floor every October with a sound the whole house recognized. Your mother dragged it to the counter without a word, peeled them by the sink on the same board she had used for years, and turned them into suppers that kept everyone full until morning. The dish at number 17 fed an entire coal mining town through the coldest stretch most of them ever lived through, and what shows up at number 9 started on one farm and spread across 3 counties because every neighbor who tasted it asked for the recipe before they left the table. These were not side dishes. These were the whole meal. Here are 25 forgotten potato suppers poor families lived on all winter. Number 25. Creamed potatoes on toast. You boiled potatoes until they were soft enough to mash with the back of a fork, then stirred in a splash of milk and a spoonful of flour to make a thick white sauce right in the pot. You spooned that over a slice of toasted bread and called it supper. Nothing else on the plate. No meat, no vegetable, no garnish. Families across the Ohio Valley and the upper Midwest ate this 2 or 3 nights a week when the money ran thin and the garden was frozen shut. The toast soaked up the cream and turned soft underneath while the top stayed warm and thick. Children scraped the plate clean and never once asked what else there was, because there was nothing else. A loaf of bread and a bag of potatoes kept a household standing through January. Number 24. Potato and sauerkraut skillet. You sliced potatoes thin, layered them in a cast iron skillet with jarred sauerkraut and a spoonful of lard, and let the whole thing cook low and slow until the edges browned and the kraut softened into the starch. The sourness of the cabbage cut through the heaviness of the potato, and the combination stretched a single jar of sauerkraut and 4 potatoes into enough food for a family of 6. German and Czech families across the plains states made this every week from October through April. You did not need seasoning beyond what the kraut already carried. Salt was built in. The lard gave it richness. When you flipped sections with a spatula, the bottom had gone crisp and golden, and that was the best part. Before I go further, for the folks who want more recipes like these, all gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of the kinds of meals you are hearing about right now, and you can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23. Potato and lentil stew. You put a handful of dried lentils in a pot of water and let them simmer while you peeled and cubed 4 or 5 potatoes. The lentils cooked down soft, and the potatoes broke apart at the edges, and after an hour on the stove, the whole thing thickened into something halfway between a soup and a porridge. You added salt, a bay leaf if you had one, and maybe a spoonful of vinegar right at the end to cut through the heaviness. Families in the Ohio River Valley and across the coal country of West Virginia lived on this for weeks at a time because a bag of lentils cost next to nothing and kept in the pantry for months. The stew reheated well, and by the second day it was even thicker and richer than the first. You ate it with a heel of bread and called it done. Number 22. Baked potatoes with drippings. When the only thing left in the pantry was a sack of potatoes and a jar of bacon drippings saved on the back of the stove, this is what you made. You scrubbed 2 or 3 potatoes clean, stabbed them with a fork, and baked them in a hot oven until the skins cracked. Then you split them open and spooned the drippings right inside, where the fat melted into the starch and turned the whole thing into something that tasted like it had no right being that good. No butter, no cheese, no sour cream, just potatoes and the rendered fat from last week's bacon. Families kept that jar on the back of the stove all winter, and every time they dipped a spoon into it, the level dropped a little lower. That jar of dripping stretched farther than any grocery run. Number 21. Potato and navy bean stew. A bag of dried navy beans cost a few cents and sat in the cupboard until you needed it, which in winter was often. You soaked the beans overnight, then simmered them the next day with cubed potatoes, an onion, and enough water to cover everything by an inch. The beans broke down and thickened the broth on their own. The potatoes held their shape just long enough to give you something to chew. Families in Appalachia and across the rural South made this stew every week from the first frost until the ground thawed. Some added a piece of salt pork if they had one. Most let the beans do the work alone. A single pot lasted 3 days if nobody took seconds, and nobody ever promised not to. There is something about a potato that every poor family understood without anyone having to say it out loud. 1 potato could be a meal. 5 potatoes could be a week. A sack of potatoes bought in October could carry you all the way to March if you stretched them right. No other vegetable did that. Carrots ran out. Canned corn was gone by Christmas. But potatoes sat in a cool, dark place and waited for you. They did not bruise easy. They did not rot fast. And they took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them with. A potato was never exciting. It was never supposed to be. It was supposed to keep you alive and full and warm at the table when the wind outside sounded like it wanted in. And it did. Number 20. Scalloped potatoes with canned evaporated milk. You sliced potatoes thin, layered them in a greased baking dish, poured a can of evaporated milk over the top, dusted it all with flour, salt, and pepper, and baked it until the top browned and the milk thickened into a sauce that clung to every slice. This was the supper that showed up when company came and you had nothing special in the house. The evaporated milk gave it a richness that regular milk could not match, and the flour kept the whole thing from being soupy. Families in the Midwest and Plains states served this on Sunday nights when the big meal had already been served at noon. You pulled the dish out of the oven, set it on a folded towel, and let people serve themselves. Nobody asked what else was for dinner. Number 19. Potato and bacon rind stew. The bacon was gone, eaten days ago, but the rinds stayed in a jar on the counter because you did not throw away anything that still had flavor. You dropped those rinds into a pot of water with cubed potatoes, a rough chopped onion, and whatever dried herbs you had hanging near the stove. The rinds simmered for hours, and the salt and smoke leached out into the broth until it turned cloudy and rich. The potatoes broke down at the edges and thickened everything. You fished out the rinds before serving, or you left them in for whoever wanted to chew on them. Families in the rural South and across Appalachia kept a rind jar the way other households kept a sugar bowl. Nothing left the kitchen until every last bit of taste had been pulled from it. The stew sat on the stove all day. By evening, it had reduced into something closer to a thick porridge than a soup, and you ladled it over cornbread or ate it straight from the bowl with a spoon. On the coldest nights, a second pot of water went on the stove to stretch what was left into tomorrow's lunch. A bag of potatoes, a jar of rinds, and an afternoon of patience turned into something worth sitting down for. Number 18. Potato dumplings in broth. You boiled potatoes until they were soft enough to mash with a fork, worked in a handful of flour and 1 egg, and rolled the dough into balls the size of a walnut. Then you dropped them into simmering beef broth or chicken broth, whichever you had, and let them cook until they floated. Czech and German families in the upper Midwest made these dumplings all winter long, sometimes as the only thing in the bowl, and sometimes alongside a piece of boiled meat that had been simmering since morning. The dumplings were dense and filling, and the broth soaked into them so every bite carried the taste of whatever stock you had built. You did not need many. 4 or 5 dumplings in a deep bowl of broth and a piece of bread was a full supper for a grown man coming in from the cold. Number 17. Potato and kielbasa bake. In the coal towns of central Pennsylvania, families stretched a single ring of kielbasa across an entire baking dish by burying it under 2 layers of sliced potatoes, a chopped onion, and enough water to steam the whole thing in the oven. The sausage fat rendered as it cooked and soaked down into the potatoes underneath, giving every slice a smoky, garlicky richness that had no business coming from a dish that simple. You cut the kielbasa thin so every serving got some meat, even if it was just a sliver tucked between 2 soft potato slices. The dish baked for about an hour and came out bubbling. Whole neighborhoods smelled exactly like this on winter nights, and the pan was empty before it had time to cool. Number 16. Colcannon. Irish families brought this dish across the Atlantic and kept making it in tenement kitchens from Boston to Philadelphia. You boiled potatoes and cabbage separately, mashed the potatoes with a little butter or milk if you had it, then folded the cooked cabbage right in. The whole thing came together in a single bowl, pale green and white, soft enough that you did not even need a knife. Some families made a well in the center of the mashed potatoes and dropped in a spoonful of melted butter that pooled there like a small golden lake. You dragged your fork through the butter and the potatoes together. Colcannon was Monday supper, Wednesday supper, Friday supper. It cost almost nothing and left everyone at the table full. It showed up whenever the week called for it. Number 15. Potato hash with whatever meat was left. You chopped last night's boiled or baked potatoes rough and fried them in a hot skillet with whatever scrap of meat the week had left behind. A bit of roast beef, a slice of ham from Sunday, a few pieces of chicken pulled off the bone. The potatoes crisped on the bottom while the meat warmed through, and the whole thing came together in about 10 minutes. This was the meal that cleaned out the icebox before grocery day. Families did not call it hash because it sounded fancy. They called it hash because you hashed everything together and hoped it tasted all right. It always did. The crispy bits at the bottom of the skillet were the best part, and everyone at the table knew it. Whoever got the last scrape of the pan won the evening. Winter had a way of teaching you what a potato could really do. In the first cold week, you might have roasted a chicken or made a stew with real beef. By the third week, the meat was gone and the vegetables from the garden had been eaten or canned months ago. What was left was potatoes, and that was when the real cooking started. The women who fed families through those months did not follow trends or read food magazines. They stood at a counter and looked at what they had. A handful of potatoes, maybe an onion, a little flour, a spoonful of fat, and they made supper out of it every single night without repeating themselves more than they had to. That kind of cooking does not have a name in any cookbook. It has a season, and the season was always winter. Number 14. Potato and egg casserole. During the hardest years of the Depression, eggs were sometimes the only protein a family could afford alongside their potatoes, and this casserole brought the two together in a baking dish that fed 6 people for almost nothing. You sliced cooked potatoes into a greased dish, cracked eggs right on top, and baked the whole thing until the whites set and the yolks were still soft enough to break with your fork. The yolk ran down into the potatoes and became the sauce. No cream, no cheese, no canned soup. Just potatoes, eggs, salt, pepper, and heat. Families in the Ohio River Valley and across the rural Midwest made this so often that their children grew up thinking every casserole had a runny egg on top. The trick was getting the timing right. Pull it out too soon and the whites were still clear. Leave it in too long and the yolks turned chalky and dry, and the whole point of the dish disappeared. Some cooks cracked the eggs into small wells pressed into the potato layer so each egg sat in its own pocket. Others laid the slices flat and let the eggs find their own place across the surface. Either way, the dish came out of the oven steaming, and you served it straight from the pan with a spatula. There was nothing elegant about it. The beauty was in what it cost and how far it went. A dozen eggs and 5 potatoes made enough supper for 2 nights, and nobody left the table hungry. On the coldest evenings, when the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, a family sitting around a table eating potato and egg casserole was not thinking about what they did not have. They were just eating together. And in those years, that was everything. Number 13. Stamp pot. Dutch farming families in Michigan and Iowa brought this dish from the old country and never stopped making it. You boiled potatoes and whatever sturdy vegetable you had, usually kale, turnips, or sauerkraut, then mashed everything together in the same pot with a fork until it was rough and chunky. A sausage went on top if the week allowed it. If not, a pat of butter and that was your plate. Stamp pot was never delicate. The whole point was to mash 2 things together until they became one thing that was heavier and warmer than either one alone. You ate it out of a deep bowl with a spoon, not a fork. The mash was never smooth and never pretty, but in January, with the wind blowing through the barn boards, nothing else on earth made more sense. Number 12. Bubble and squeak. Last night's mashed potatoes and whatever boiled cabbage or Brussels sprouts were left over got pressed together into a thick cake and fried in a skillet until both sides turned dark and crisp. The name came from the sound it made in the pan, bubbling and squeaking as the moisture cooked out. English working-class families brought this to America, and it stuck in mill towns and factory neighborhoods where nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. The outside crust shattered when you cut into it, and the inside was soft and steaming. Some families fried an egg alongside and put the whole thing on one plate, breakfast or supper, depending on the time of day. Bubble and Squeak asked for nothing but leftovers and a hot skillet. Number 11. Potato and cheese pie. A cast-iron skillet lined with sliced potatoes. Thin slices of whatever hard cheese you had, usually a cheddar or a dry jack, another layer of potatoes, a pour of milk, and into the oven until the top browned and the cheese melted down through every layer. Farm families in New England and the upper Midwest baked this when the root cellar was running low and the cheese wheel was the richest thing they owned. The pie baked slowly, and the cheese turned stringy and golden between the potato layers. You cut it into wedges like a regular pie and served it with nothing on the side. One skillet fed 4 people. The cheese made it feel like a small luxury when it was really just 2 ingredients and time. Number 10. Potato bread as the whole meal. When the potatoes themselves were running low, families stretched them by boiling a few, mashing them smooth, and mixing the mash into bread dough. The potato kept the bread soft for days, which regular bread never managed in a cold kitchen. You baked a round loaf, sliced it thick, and ate it with a bowl of broth or just a smear of whatever fat was in the house. In the Ozarks and across the southern Appalachian Hills, potato bread was not a side dish. It was the meal. A single loaf made from 2 potatoes and a cup of flour could feed 3 people if nobody was greedy. The bread stayed soft even after it cooled, and the next morning you sliced it again and toasted it in a dry skillet. Nobody called it artisan, they called it making do. Number 9. Potato and turnip stew. 3 or 4 potatoes and a turnip or 2, cubed rough, went into a heavy pot with a sweated onion. You covered the vegetables with water and let the whole thing simmer until the turnips went soft and the potatoes started dissolving into the broth. The turnips added a faint sweetness that plain potato soup never had, and the combination made a broth thick enough that you almost did not need bread. Farming families across Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri made this stew through every cold month, and neighbors passed the recipe along because anyone who tasted it at somebody else's table went home and made their own the same week. No meat, no cream, no stock cube, just roots and water and an hour of patience. The stew tasted better on the second day after the turnip flavor deepened and the potatoes had broken down a little more. A pot of this on a January evening was warmth itself. Nobody writes cookbooks about feeding yourself in the cold with almost nothing. There are no magazine spreads, no television chefs demonstrating how to stretch 5 potatoes into 3 days of suppers. But that kind of cooking is the oldest and most honest tradition in American kitchens. It did not come from Paris or Rome. It came from necessity, from a woman standing at a stove in a drafty house making something warm out of almost nothing, night after night, without complaining and without quitting. The families who lived on these meals did not have fancy words for what they were doing. They were just eating. And the suppers they made, plain and simple and repeated until the ground thawed, kept whole generations alive and together at the same table. That is not a small thing. Number 8. Fried potato cakes from last night's mash. Nobody threw out leftover mashed potatoes. You scooped cold mash into your hands, pressed it flat, and dropped the cakes into a skillet with a spoonful of lard or bacon grease. They fried until the outside turned brown and crisp, and the inside stayed soft and warm. Some cooks mixed in a beaten egg or a handful of flour to hold them together, but plenty of families skipped that and just pressed the cakes firm enough to hold their shape in the pan. You ate them plain or with a fried egg on top, and they turned yesterday's side dish into tonight's whole supper. During the Depression, families in mill towns from Pittsburgh to Birmingham made these 2 or 3 nights a week because the potatoes were already cooked and the grease was already in the can by the stove. Nothing went to waste, and the cakes tasted better than the mash they came from. Number 7. Potato and onion pie. Potatoes and onions sliced thin, layered in a cast iron skillet or a pie dish. Each layer dotted with a small piece of butter, the whole thing filled with just enough milk to reach the top. Then into a low oven for a long, slow bake. No crust, no eggs, no cheese. The onions caramelized against the potatoes, and the milk reduced into a thin sauce that held everything together. Wives of coal miners in Kentucky and West Virginia baked this on payday and on lean weeks alike because the ingredients never changed and the cost never climbed. The pie came out golden on top and soft underneath. You cut it with a knife and it held its shape on the plate. 2 ingredients and a little patience, and supper was done. Number 6. Potato chowder. Diced potatoes and onions simmered in water until tender, then a can of evaporated milk stirred in with a few tablespoons of butter, salt, pepper, and nothing else. New England families who could not afford clams made this chowder instead, and in winter it showed up on tables from Maine to Connecticut, so often that most children assumed chowder meant potatoes, not fish. The broth was thick and white, almost creamy, and the potato chunks were soft enough to mash against the side of the bowl with your spoon. Some families crumbled crackers on top. Others floated a torn piece of bread on the surface until it soaked through. A pot of potato chowder warmed you from the inside out and cost so little that making another batch the next night never felt like a question. Number 5. Potato and salt pork stew. A slab of salt pork sat in a barrel in the cellar, and when you needed protein, you cut off a thick slice and dropped it into the pot. The salt dissolved into the cooking water and seasoned everything at once. You added cubed potatoes and an onion and let the whole thing simmer until the pork went tender and the potatoes had soaked up every bit of that salty, savory broth. Families in rural mill towns and across the frontier kept a barrel of salt pork the way people today keep a freezer full of chicken. It was the backup plan, the insurance, the thing standing between you and real hunger. This stew tasted like winter itself, salty, heavy, warm, and plain enough that you could eat it every week without tiring of it. Number 4. Boxty. Irish immigrant families in New York and across New England kept this dish alive for generations after crossing the ocean. You grated raw potato into a bowl, mixed it with leftover mashed potato, added flour and salt, and fried the batter in a skillet like a thick pancake. The raw potato gave it a dense, chewy center, and the mashed potato held everything together. Some families made boxty so thick it was almost bread. Others fried it thin and crispy and stacked 3 or 4 on a plate. Either way, it was a full supper built from nothing but potatoes and flour. The name boxty comes from an old Irish phrase that roughly translates to poor house bread. The name told you everything you needed to know about who ate it and why. Number 3. Lancashire hot pot. In English mill towns and later in factory neighborhoods across the American Northeast, a hot pot meant one thing. You layered sliced potatoes, sliced onions, and whatever cheap cut of mutton or lamb neck you could find in a deep pot, filled it with water, covered it tight, and baked it low for hours. The potatoes on top browned and crisped. The potatoes underneath dissolved into the broth and turned it thick as gravy. The meat fell right off the bone. This was a working family's meal, designed to go into the oven before you left for the factory and come out ready when you walked through the door. Nobody stood at the stove watching it because the pot did the cooking and the time did the seasoning. A hot pot smelled like coming home at the end of a long day in the cold. Number 2. Potato and sardine supper. You opened a tin of sardines, mashed them with a fork right there in the can, and spooned them over a plate of hot-boiled potatoes. The oil from the sardines soaked into the potatoes and gave them a rich, salty flavor that needed nothing else. Maybe you added a splash of vinegar or a few slices of raw onion on the side, but that was all. Fishing families along the Atlantic coast and factory workers across New England ate this once or twice a week because a tin of sardines cost pennies and the potatoes were already in the cellar. The meal came together in the time it took to boil water. You did not need a recipe or a plan. You needed a can opener, a pot, and 10 minutes. Children ate it without complaint because the sardines were soft and mild and the potatoes filled them up. It was plain, it was cheap, and it kept a family fed on nights when there was nothing else in the house. Number 1. Potato water broth. When even the potatoes were running low, you saved the water you boiled them in. That starchy, cloudy liquid went back on the stove with a pinch of salt, a scrap of onion, and whatever you could find. Sometimes a heel of stale bread dropped in to thicken it. Sometimes nothing at all. You drank it from a cup or ate it from a bowl, and it warmed you from the inside on nights when the pantry held nothing but a half-empty sack and hope. Families during the worst winters of the early 20th century treated potato water the way other households treated stock. You never poured it down the drain. That water carried starch, minerals, and just enough substance to call it a meal when there was no meal left to make. Grandmothers taught their daughters to save it without ever explaining why. The reason was understood. You keep what keeps you alive, and on the coldest night of the longest winter, a bowl of warm potato water, salted and served at a table with your family around you, was enough. It was not the last resort. It was the foundation everything else on this list was built from. Old-fashioned potato cakes are a forgotten recipe that really filled up a lot of people's stomachs on days where nothing else was available. Even on days where you did have a lot of food in the pantry and enough money in the wallet to go out for something else, if you didn't feel whatever was there at home, these potato cakes were an easy-to-make recipe that were sort of the zenith of comfort food. It was all about that crispy exterior, something you only got after a lot of trial and error with the right amount of oil and the time. Most recommend you fry them for a good 15 to 20 minutes, but I think everyone should experiment and find whatever works for them best, because any variation means a different texture. What you get are these wonderful cakes made out of mashed potatoes shaped into cakes. It's a pretty fun way to have potatoes if you're tired of the usual mashed potato and fries routine we go through every week. They're old-fashioned for a reason, though. Eventually, Americans would just start exploring more baking techniques from other cultures, and of course, that meant taking a good crack at their actual cakes, and the fancy ones too at that. Number 21. Half-runner green beans simmered with a ham hock. Half-runners were the bean of choice across the southern mountains. Not quite a pole bean and not quite a bush bean. Somewhere in between with a sweetness that snaps could not touch. You broke them by hand into pieces, dropped them into a big pot with a smoked ham hock, and let them cook for hours. Not 20 minutes. Hours. The beans turned soft and dark and soaked up every bit of smoke from that pork. The pot liquor at the bottom was worth more than the beans themselves. People sopped it up with cornbread or drank it straight from a cup. I still think a bowl of half-runners and a wedge of cornbread is one of the most honest suppers ever put on a table. This next one is even more on the fancier side than fondant potatoes, and I'm pretty sure it deserves to be here too. This one is known as Syracuse salt potatoes. And fun fact, though you might have already guessed, these came from Syracuse, New York. It has its roots in the 19th century when it was made using local potatoes that would then be boiled in salt brine from the local springs, but today, you don't need to do any of that. Over time, the dish has become a lot more accessible, which honestly works out great for potato heads like me because it means we get to eat this so much more often. The star of the show this time really is that Syracuse salt, which gives the natural flavor of a potato one serious boost. But the fact that they've been boiled gives them a perfectly creamy interior that's just to die for as soon as you get your first taste in. It's a no-fuss recipe that doesn't demand much of you except maybe a trip to the store for the right salt and potatoes, but even that can be ordered online now. Number 14. Cornfield beans and new potatoes. Cornfield beans were planted right alongside the corn. The vines climbed the stalks, and by midsummer you had both crops in the same row. The beans were picked young, when the pods were still tender, and cooked fresh with small new potatoes dug from the edge of the garden. You put everything in a pot with water, a piece of smoked pork, and a little salt. It simmered until the potatoes were soft enough to break apart with a fork and the beans had turned silky. The broth was thin but full of flavor. This was a July supper. The potatoes were barely bigger than a walnut. The beans still had dirt on them 20 minutes before they hit the pot. Polish pierogies are what they sound like. It was a dish that got here to America through the Polish immigrants that started settling in places like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and they formed the very first Polish-American communities in America's history. It's a little different from the stuff we're used to seeing on the list so far, and it's definitely not a casserole, nor does it have the same heavyweight group meal power that you'd associate with a dish like that, but what it lacks in filling capabilities it makes up for in a lot of extremely well-rounded flavors. Pierogies are filled with mashed potatoes that have been mixed with cheese, but a lot of different fillings like sauerkraut, mushroom, and potato mixes, and ground meat are also used, and then they're boiled or pan-fried. As a result, they end up having this chewy sensation with a soft but addictive filling inside. It has a bit of a tang to it, but it takes care of most flavors you'd want from a savory dish, and the caramelized onions were just made for this dish. It's a hallmark of Polish-American cooking, and I can definitely see why. Number 17. Squirrel and dumplings. A man with a .22 rifle and a steady eye could bring home enough squirrel for supper in half an hour. You skinned them, cleaned them, and simmered the whole pieces in salted water for a long time because squirrel meat gets tough if you rush it. Once the meat was tender enough to fall off the bone, you pulled it out, stripped the meat, and put it back in the broth. Then came the dumplings. Strips of dough made from flour, a little lard, and just enough water to hold it together. You dropped them into the boiling broth one at a time, and they puffed up and soaked in all that wild, gamey flavor. It was darker and richer than chicken and dumplings. It tasted like the woods themselves. Meat and tater hot dishes. Where do we even begin with this one? It's up there in the casserole history books, and that's just an objective fact you can't argue with. When you get as much traction as this recipe has at potlucks, family gatherings, church events, and community dinners, then you just solidify yourself as a solid contender for America's Culinary Hall of Fame, and these have definitely earned their spot. If you went to Minnesota, this was basically all you could find in the early 20th century if you go back to before the recession devastated everything. A hot dish might make you think of some kind of meat and tater tot combo, but it was actually just a local term for a casserole that could be made in one pan. The mushroom cream soup is here to die for, and the beef just elevated every flavor the potatoes brought and wrapped the whole thing up in a wonderful little bow. You top that off with some shredded cheese and crispy onions, and you have yourself a casserole experience you'd never see coming from a mile away if you just stuck to the traditionals and the tried and tested. It's good to put yourself out there, not just for friends or romance, but also for food. You may be surprised about all the tastes you haven't discovered yet that have been sitting under your nose this whole time. Then again, that's what I'm here for, right? Number 19. Catfish stew. The catfish came out of the creek, not the store. You caught them on trot lines or sat on the bank with a cane pole and a chicken liver until something pulled. Once you had a few good ones, you skinned them, filleted them, and cut the meat into chunks. The stew started with bacon grease in a Dutch oven. You fried onions and potatoes until they were soft, added water, dropped in the catfish, and let the whole thing simmer until the fish was flaky and the broth turned thick. Some people added a can of tomatoes. Others kept it plain. You ate it with cornbread and nothing else. That stew was thick enough to hold a spoon straight up, and the catfish gave it a sweetness you could not get from any other meat. Fondant potatoes were a recipe from the middle of the 20th century that took well. A little too well, if you ask me. They were these rick rounds of potatoes that were first browned in butter until they were golden and then slow cooked in chicken or beef stock. As a result, you get potatoes with the perfect crisp exterior and an extremely flavorful and tender interior. This kind of dish was sometimes seen as rich people's food, even though it's really not that deep. It's just potatoes that have been mixed with some butter. Plus, it doesn't help that the dish only started appearing in high-end American restaurants later on towards the end of the 20th century and gained a reputation for being a potato dish that was a bit more fancy and on the gourmet side. Nowadays, though, you could just whip this up in your own home. That goes for a lot of these dishes, actually. They've become exponentially easier to make, and the ingredients are also a lot easier to get. So if you were looking for any ideas for a new TikTok, then there's a lot of inspiration you could get from here. The grocery store was not part of the routine, not the way it is now. The nearest store might have been 15 miles of gravel road, and the truck only made it there when the weather allowed. So the garden was the grocery store. The root cellar was the pantry. The smokehouse was the meat counter. A woman feeding a family of 6 did not write a shopping list. She walked outside and looked at what was growing, what was cured, what was canned on the shelf, and she built supper from that. If the beans were ready, you ate beans. If the squash was coming in, you ate squash. The menu was never a choice. It was an answer to a question the land asked every single day. So, another note Americans took out of another country's cookbook was France's Dauphinoise potatoes, which were also known as gratin dauphinois because the dish originated from the Dauphin region in southeastern France. If you want to be pretty uptight about it, you best follow tradition, and you know how the French get about deviating from the recipe. It's made with raw potatoes and heavy cream, then layered and baked in a pretty slow place. The trick here is the use of the heavy cream, which almost gives it a pretty nutty taste that works really well with the layers of potato laced with notes of garlic and onions. You also really need to make sure you use either Gruyere or cheddar cheese, because otherwise you just won't get that nutty flavor that makes this dish work so well. It's an 18th century classic, so I can't say it hasn't had its time to shine, but come on, doesn't it sound cool? For the French, they'd always have it with steaks, roasts, and any kind of protein-based main course, and Americans have honestly treated it much the same way. But the dish gives off an air of luxury and works well as a side, elevating any dish that it's paired with. If it were still around, I'd definitely try ordering. What about you? You can't have a recipe list about potato dishes that'll leave your grandma's cooking in the dust and not get into a little casserole-based magic, can you? Although a lot of people might take that personally because, if we're being real, it's pretty damn hard to outclass any grandma's casserole. It's what Bruce Lee said about practicing one kick 10,000 times rather than 10,000 kicks once. That's a dish grandmas have spent their entire cooking careers perfecting, serving endless casseroles as family dinners and party meals. So when the idea of a hamburger potato casserole rolled around, suffice it to say people didn't exactly take to it too well. The ground beef, potatoes, onions, and the cheesy tangy sauce combo was a bit strong flavor-wise to immediately take off, but when the Second World War meant that people had to ration and keep things really budget-friendly, a lot more people started to warm up to the idea of a casserole made entirely of potatoes and a little bit of beef, especially because proteins like that had gotten rare back in the day, unless you were rich. But if you were, you wouldn't be eating potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner back then either, would you? Cooking in the mountains was not something people did for fun. It was work, and it started before the sun came up. A woman stoked the fire in the wood stove, hauled water from the spring, and started something on the stove that would take all day. She did not own a timer. She had instinct. She knew the beans were done by the way the pot sounded. She knew the bread was ready by the color of the crust. There were no shortcuts because there was nothing to cut short. Everything took exactly as long as it took, and the people who sat down to eat that food understood what it cost. Not in money, in hours and in hands that never stopped moving. Cheesy scalloped potatoes with ham were a great one. This was one of those potato dishes that was really the main star, the tourist attraction, the cream of the crop. It highlighted the potato and really worked around it as an ingredient, but it was because the potato was there that the accessories in the dish, like the scallop, ham, and cheese, were all so much better. That's how you know you're sitting on gold, because when your ingredients and preparation synergize that well, you're cooking up something amazing. Cheesy, scalloped potatoes with ham were a pretty common option for Thanksgiving because they had that homely feeling and they made use of the most simple, everyday ingredients like Gruyere or cheddar cheese and cheap ham, garlic, and onion. I mean, who doesn't have that laying around? Maybe you might need to go shopping for the cheese, but that's really about it. This is a simple and versatile dish that also puts in a little bit of seafood for people who like their potatoes with some fresh catches of the day, and you can always up the seasoning. It's not really a main course, but it outclasses most of your typical appetizers. Potatoes as a whole would go more towards being side pieces in dishes though, thanks to fast food culture, so stuff like this didn't stick around for too long. Number 12. Salt pork and wild greens. Salt pork was the backup when the smokehouse ran low. It was pork belly cured in nothing but salt, packed in a barrel, and it lasted months without spoiling. You sliced off a piece, soaked it in water to pull some of the salt out, and fried it in a skillet until brown and crispy. The greens came from wherever you could find them. Creasy greens along the creek, dock leaves from the pasture. You wilted them in the pork fat left in the skillet, added a splash of vinegar, and that was your plate. Salt, fat, and something green. It was not elegant, but it kept people standing through some very lean springs when there was nothing else to put on a plate. JoJo potatoes are a rustic, hearty dish that came right out of the Midwest in the 1960s and 70s and made a firm statement about how it was here to stay. I mean, it was beating all other snacks, and most fast food places were putting this on their menus, whipping up new deals and discounts and advertising their best take on JoJo potatoes. And I get why. Thick potato wedges with actual seasoning? I'm talking about garlic, paprika, salt, pepper, thyme, and herbs. A crispy first bite and a fluffy and filling interior? They're literally the perfect thing to have with a pizza, and they're one of the best ways I've ever seen to make potato wedges. It's classic American comfort food. No fuss, no mess. What you see is what you get, and it's perfect for families. The recipe has insane value for money, and we as a nation have always stood by convenience food that gives the most bang for your buck. The only thing I'm not really sure about is how the name JoJo got stuck to the dish, but it's pretty catchy. Number 15. Poke salad. The pokeweed plant grew everywhere, along roadsides, at the edges of fields, behind barns, in ditches. It came up fast every spring, with thick green leaves and purple stems that could reach 6 feet by midsummer. And every part of that plant was poisonous. The berries could kill a child. The roots could kill a grown man. Even the leaves, if you picked them after the stems turned purple, carried enough toxin to make you violently sick. But people ate it anyway, because in April, when the garden was bare and the cellar was running low, those young poke shoots were the first green thing out of the ground. You picked the leaves small and bright green before the plant got any height, then you boiled them 3 times, changing the water after each boil to pull the poison out. 3 full boils, 3 full drains. After the 3rd one, you squeezed the greens dry, chopped them up, and fried them in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. That was poke salad. Some called it poke salette, from the old French word for a cooked green dish. The taste was somewhere between spinach and asparagus, earthier, with a bitterness the bacon grease smoothed out. Communities across eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia held poke dinners in church basements every spring. The older women taught the younger ones which leaves to pick and which to leave alone. One wrong choice could send you to the hospital. People trusted their mothers and their grandmothers, and they ate that plant for generations without a second thought. Tony Joe White wrote a song about it in 1968. He called it Poke Salad Annie, and it became a hit because millions of people in the rural South knew exactly what he was singing about. That plant was groceries when there were no groceries, and the women who cooked it knew the line between supper and poison by heart. Nothing like a bit of grandma against grandma action to get into high gear as we get halfway through the list. This time we have Great Grandma John's pasties, though there wasn't actually any Grandma John. What there was, however, was a massive influx of migrants from Europe in areas like Michigan's peninsulas. They would come from Cornwall, and they were usually here to try their hand at mining. One of the childhood favorites of theirs used to be this pastry with a filling of diced potatoes, a flaky and golden crust, and incredibly balanced flavor profiles that make it the perfect dish to have at a party or a celebration. If you feel hungry and like you can't manage without some quick and easy comfort food, then they're great for that too. It's mostly just how easy these pasties are to make and how good they work if you start baking in a batch. Plus, they're one of the few recipes out there to use stuff like rutabaga and ground or cubed meat, which really adds to the savory aspect of the dish. All in all, this is a solid one from our British friends, and it might just show you a whole new side to potatoes you hadn't imagined before. Number 20. Cracklin' cornbread with a mess of greens. When a hog was butchered in late fall, nothing went to waste. The skin and the fat were cut into small pieces and rendered in a big iron pot over an open fire. What came out were cracklings, golden brown nuggets of pork that were crispy on the outside and impossibly rich on the inside. Those cracklings went straight into the cornbread batter. You mixed your cornmeal with a little flour, buttermilk, an egg if you had one, a pinch of soda, and a generous handful of those cracklings. Then you poured the batter into a screaming hot skillet greased with lard and baked it until the top cracked and the edges turned dark brown. That cornbread was heavier than the regular kind, saltier, with little bursts of pork flavor in every bite. You could hear the cracklings crunch when you bit down. On the side, there was always a mess of greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, creasy greens, whatever was growing along the fence or in the garden. You cooked them low and slow in a deep pot with a piece of smoked jowl and a splash of vinegar. They cooked down to a fraction of their original size. A whole bushel of raw greens barely filled a serving bowl. You tore off pieces of cornbread and dragged them through the pot liquor pooled on your plate. The combination worked because the cracklings brought salt and fat and crunch, and the greens brought iron and bitterness and depth. One without the other was fine. Together, they were something worth sitting down for. In a lot of homes, this was Saturday supper from November through March. The cracklings made that cornbread feel like a feast, even when there was not a single other thing on the table. Daisy's potato dressing is a name that just gets you in the mood for a nice day in a cottage or relaxing at home. I wouldn't blame you, since the dish puts you in exactly that kind of mood too. It's one of those dishes you enjoy when the summer breeze hits just right, the cats being awfully nice, the plants look even greener. One of those days where it feels like God's giving everyone some much-needed rest and relaxation. Daisy's potato dressing is a lesser-known twist on bread-based dressings, and it got its reputation being passed around family dinners all over the South and Midwest. Potatoes usually replace bread to make the filling, and these dishes include mashed and grated potatoes with sautéed onions and celery, plus more staple herbs you'd find in your pantry like sage and thyme. Since it's America, you can never do without some kind of meat, so people would often even add diced sausages or crumbled bacon to the mix for a bit of a flavorful push. You get an incredibly nice dressing that feels light on the stomach, doesn't bloat you, and is great for Thanksgiving appetizers. This dish actually came into existence because of rural communities that made a lot of use of potatoes because of how plentiful they are. See? I told you we've been best buddies for hundreds of years. I just wish I could go to a time where this was available in stores or where all the neighbors were making it, because now it's just not something you see anymore unless you go out of your way to explore food history here, like you are now. Number 22. Fried ramps and potatoes. Every spring, when the snow melted off the north-facing slopes, the ramps came up. They grew wild under poplar trees in the rich bottomland, and people dug them by the sackful. The smell was somewhere between garlic and onion, but stronger than both. You sliced the bulbs thin, chopped the green tops, and fried everything in a cast-iron skillet with diced potatoes and bacon grease. The ramps turned sweet when they hit the heat. The potatoes crisped around the edges. In towns like Richwood, West Virginia, there were ramp suppers at the fire hall every April. You could smell who had been eating them from across the parking lot. Nobody cared. That was the price of spring, and it was worth paying. This is a mix that took me a while to get used to, if I'm being totally honest with you. Jalapeno popper potato salad was a name that took me for a spin when I first heard it because, well, jalapenos and potatoes? Experimentative and reasonable. I can see the potential. There's just a lot of room to miss, you know? But luckily, that's one thing this dish just doesn't know how to do. It's made with boiled potatoes, pickled and diced jalapenos, crispy bits of bacon, shredded cheese, Parmesan or cheddar, and your choice of onions. The base is a creamy mayonnaise or sour cream mix, and you end up getting an extremely lovely salad that has smokiness and savoriness and is great for picnics and barbecues. Now, I don't know about you, but that's definitely what I'd call range. This is actually a dish that's pretty popular in Mexican culture, and this dish is considered to be a mix of the two cultures interacting and finding a sweet middle ground we can all enjoy and love. Number 23. Soup beans with chow chow. Soup beans meant pinto beans, and in Appalachia they cooked all day. You sorted them the night before, picking out the rocks and the shriveled ones. Soaked them overnight, drained them in the morning, and set them on the stove with a chunk of salt pork. By supper time, the house smelled like something sacred. The chow chow came out of a mason jar, bright and tangy, a pickled relish made from the end of the garden. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers, all chopped fine and put up in late summer. You spooned it right on top of those beans. The sweet and sour cut through all that rich, smoky pork flavor in a way that made every bite different from the last. Remember how I said that Americans kind of wanted to start exploring new dishes from other cultures? One of those was seeing what Jewish people got up to in the kitchen, and a few sneak peeks revealed potato kugels and how amazing they could really be. This dish has Ashkenazi roots, and it's often served during Sabbath or other Jewish traditions and important events and days. It's pretty crispy, just like potato cakes, but in a bit of a more subtle way. With those, it's like the crunch is the main element, but here, it's just another nice texture amongst many other notable ones. It's soft on the inside, for example, so you get a pretty satisfying sensation with each bite. You use grated or pureed potatoes and mix them with eggs, salt, pepper, and onions, and you end up getting a pretty nicely balanced dish. Some sweetness from the onion, the earthiness of the potato, the slight kick from the salt and pepper, and a thick consistency thanks to the eggs. Jewish immigrants brought this one over, and I'm pretty glad they did. I just wish it could stick around long enough to be a menu item today too, but unfortunately, this went back to being a thing you'd only know about if you grew up in traditional old-school Jewish families. Number 13. Creek Bank Fish Fry. On a Friday evening in summer, you took whatever you had caught that week and fried it right there beside the water. Bluegill, smallmouth bass, brook trout, whatever the creek gave up. You cleaned the fish on a flat rock, dredged the pieces in cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried them in a cast iron skillet set over a fire between two rocks. The grease was lard, brought from the house in a coffee can. The fish cooked in a few minutes, and you ate it with your fingers straight off a piece of newspaper. There was no table and no plates. Whatever you caught, you cooked. Whatever you cooked, you ate right there on the bank with your hands. Some families did this every Friday from May through September, and the children never forgot it. Potato candy is a pretty unique treat, and it's definitely the first time you've heard of a potato-based dessert on this list so far. This dish got really popular in places like the southern areas of America and Appalachia. It's not surprising that you can't find this dish anymore, since this is one straight out of the Great Depression. And you want to know why? It's because people had developed a culture of no-bake dishes that didn't require traditional baking ingredients because they were becoming so awfully hard to come by, and it just wasn't realistic to use that much money for flour, eggs, and batter when you could get bread, potatoes, and vegetables instead. It was all about practicality. But this dish shows one thing a lot of people don't talk about enough when it comes to the recession that changed everything for the 20th century. People still love to eat. I know that sounds redundant, but in times of massive scarcity, it's easy to fall into a mindset of, well, if I don't need it, it's a waste. But it was all really sudden, and people still loved to eat sweet things to feel good. They loved comfort food. They wanted their favorite casserole or meatloaf. It was that need that gave birth to things like potato candies. Some powdered sugar and mashed potatoes together made a sweet dough that would be spread with peanut butter, rolled into a log and sliced, and honestly, you couldn't even tell this was a potato dish. Number 16. Fried green tomatoes as the whole supper. When the first frost was on its way and the tomatoes on the vine were still green, you picked every last one. Some went into chow chow, some got wrapped in newspaper to ripen on the windowsill, but the rest got sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet with enough lard to come halfway up the sides. The coating turned golden and crisp. The tomato inside stayed firm and tart. In some homes, that was the entire supper: a plate of fried green tomatoes, a glass of buttermilk, and maybe a biscuit left over from breakfast. It was not a side dish. It was the main event, and when it showed up on the table, everybody knew summer was officially over. Dutchess potatoes are kind of as fancy as they sound, but also not really. See, You think I mean a 5-star dish at a critically acclaimed restaurant. But I really just mean special occasions like birthdays and anniversaries. Well, they used to make them for those kinds of days before. Nowadays, you just order takeout, but anyway, this is about better times. You take some mashed potatoes, butter, crema, and egg yolks, and you end up getting a really custard-like texture. Then you just need to fill a pipe with that mix and pipe it into rosettes and other nice fancy shapes. Hey, some go for dinosaurs, others go for roses. Bring out the sculptor in you and find out what you like. If you prefer to be more straight to business and not waste time decorating your food, something I can really respect, by the way, then you can always just go for basic shapes. All you gotta do then is bake them. And voila, you get an incredibly fancy-looking and tasting dish that might not come out of a palace, but will still have you feeling like royalty. Number 24. Cornbread crumbled in sweet milk. You took a piece of leftover cornbread, broke it into a tall glass, and poured cold milk over the top. Then you ate it with a spoon. That was supper. It sounds like nothing, but in the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, this was what people ate when the real meal had already been served at noon. Dinner was the big meal in the middle of the day. Supper was lighter, and for a lot of families, cornbread and milk was exactly enough. The cornbread soaked up the milk and turned soft, almost like pudding. Children loved it. Old folks still talk about it like it was the best thing they ever tasted. Pommes de terre soufflé are a much more nuanced dish than the rest. I say nuanced because they require a real sensitive touch and a very attention-to-detail-oriented mindset when you get to work with them. You have to slice the potatoes in a really particular way to start with. You have this really decorative oval shape that looks wonderful, then you need to fry them twice, but you need to be really mindful of the temperature and time. The first fry has to be at a lower temperature, but the second one needs to be cooked with higher heat so that the potatoes can actually puff up. The point of this is to sort of make sure that they're hollow on the inside, and that's most of your work done. Then there's the most crucial part, the right amount of salt. It really can ruin the whole thing, you know? If you do get the hang of it, then you're going to be the person with the most impressive basket whenever you go to your next family picnic. Number 18. Brown beans and fatback. Brown beans were not the same as pintos. They were smaller, darker, and they had a deeper, earthier taste. In parts of Virginia and North Carolina, brown beans were what people grew because pintos did not do well in that particular soil. You cooked them the same way, sorted, soaked, simmered all day with a thick slab of fatback buried in the pot. Fatback was pure pork fat, no meat on it at all, scored with a knife so the salt could seep into the beans. By evening, those beans were so soft they fell apart on the spoon. You served them in a bowl with a wedge of cornbread, and that was supper. The taste was earthier and deeper than pintos, and the people who grew up on brown beans will tell you they are the superior bean without hesitation. This actually kind of started getting popular in the Depression, but fully settled in as a resident of American culture when we started to ask our immigrant communities and foreign neighbors what they do with their potatoes. The answer was a lot more simple than you'd expect, but it's also not something you would see coming if your idea of potatoes hasn't expanded past it being a side to meaty main courses. Potato dumplings are made by mashed or grated potatoes with flour, eggs, and sometimes even breadcrumbs, and the end result is these really flavorful dumplings that are perfect for munching. That first bite has all that chewy goodness you associate with a dumpling, but you'll notice it eventually melts into a much softer sensation that fits exactly what you think a potato dumpling would taste and feel like. It was pretty common in the Midwest, and it was often served alongside stews or served on platters as a party dish. Number 11. Baked cushaw squash. The cushaw was an enormous striped squash, green and white, shaped like a long crookneck, and it could grow to 30 pounds or more. It was an Appalachian heirloom that almost nobody outside the mountains had ever seen. You split it open, scooped out the seeds, laid the halves in a roasting pan, and baked it slow. When it was done, the flesh was golden and smooth, somewhere between pumpkin and sweet potato. You scooped it out and mashed it with butter and a little salt. Some families added brown sugar. I think cushaw deserves more attention than it gets. People grew them because they stored beautifully in the root cellar, and a single one could feed a family for a week. There was a kind of dignity in feeding yourself from what you grew. Nobody talked about it that way at the time. Nobody called it self-sufficient or sustainable. Those words came later, from somewhere else. But the act itself, walking into your own garden, pulling food from the ground, cooking it in your own kitchen, and setting it on the table for people you loved, that was the whole point. It did not matter that the meal was simple. What mattered was that you made it. That you showed up at the stove when you were tired and your back hurt and nothing about it was glamorous. You fed your family because that is what you did. The food was plain, but the act was not. Stewed potatoes are a pretty common one. We all know them, and we've probably all had them. Before I really get into the goodness of stewed potatoes, though, let me tell you why I think America and potatoes are besties and have been for a pretty long while. See, you're no stranger to the harsh history of the United States of America and how it's really put citizens through the ringer more times than I can count. The recession, the wars, the economic slumps and ruts, inflation. A lot of situations that make it hard to put a fresh, hot meal that tastes good on the table every day. It was in times like these that potatoes became really important because they were easy to grow, readily available, and could be made in just about every sort of way you can imagine. In times like those, it was pretty common to stew potatoes and make a simple but effective dish that only needed to be seasoned with a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a bit of butter if you like that extra vibrant flavor. The potatoes would get soft, almost like a mushy, earthy cream, and the slow cooking really amplified their tenderness. Mix some onions, and you have yourself a dish good for the whole family, and for what? Literally no effort. That's just a good deal, and to be honest, after a hard day spent dozing off on company time, I'd love to come home to something that's easy to cook. It's just sad that simple go-tos like this end up vanishing when things get better for the country and people get access to better, more complex, and extravagant food. Number 25. Killed lettuce. You pulled the leaf lettuce straight from the garden, washed it, and piled it into a big bowl. Then you fried up some bacon, and when the grease was popping hot, you poured it right over the leaves. They wilted down to almost nothing. A splash of vinegar went in next, maybe a pinch of sugar to cut the sharpness. Some families crumbled a hard-boiled egg on top. Others added sliced green onions from the yard. That was the whole supper on a hot night in June. I have talked to people who moved away from the mountains 50 years ago, and killed lettuce is still the thing they miss most. The store-bought kind in a plastic bag does not come close to what came out of that garden. Brie and potato frittata bites are the perfect thing for a salad bar, an appetizer, or a light, low-calorie snack that you can enjoy without any kind of worries. Brie cheese is pretty healthy on its own, but there's a lot that can be done to amplify its taste, and luckily, that's exactly what happens when you mix it in with some potatoes. You cut the potatoes into a frittata form and lightly cook the potatoes with some eggs, herbs, and cheese, then taking some muffin tins, you bake them. What you end up getting is a perfectly seasoned, very warm and comforting dish that follows the classic American philosophy of taking the simplest things in life, mixing them together, and creating something that's way more than either of those things could individually be. I mean, sure, we all love a good brie sandwich and we all love a good potato-based snack, but when you mix them together, it's just unreal. Plus, you throw some chives and dip fries in that bad boy, you're not getting up for the next hour. Pick one of these suppers this week. Just one. Peel a few potatoes, heat up a skillet or a pot, and make it the way your mother or your grandmother did, without measuring a single thing. If you grew up eating any of these